I've got a paranormal story that still creeps me out to this day. This happened back in the early 2000s when I was working at a clothing retail store at the local mall. I was in my early 20s at the time and I needed the job to help pay for college. The store was called the Fashion Hub, and it was a mid-sized clothing retailer that sold both men's and women's clothing. It was located right in the middle of the mall corridor, so it got decent foot traffic during the day, but things would get really quiet during evening hours. So, I started working there as a sales associate. My hours varied depending on the week, but I usually worked either closing shifts or mid-afternoon to evening shifts. Most of the time the store was fine. Nothing unusual ever happened. It was just a typical retail job. We'd help customers fold clothes, stock shelves, and clean up at the end of the day. But there was always something that felt off about the store once it got late in the evening. I remember talking to some of my coworkers about it, and a few of them mentioned that they had felt the same way. There was this unsettling feeling in certain parts of the store, particularly in the back storage room and in the men's clothing section towards the back corner. But nobody ever really talked about it too much. We all kind of just dealt with it. One night I was working a closing shift. It was probably around 8:30 or so, and the store was pretty dead. We were supposed to close at 9 p.m. There were only two of us working that night, me and my manager, Derek. Derek was a cool guy. He'd been working there for a few years and didn't really seem bothered by anything. We were just going about our closing duties, organizing the displays, and getting things ready to lock up for the night. I remember I was in the men's section, folding some shirts that customers had left on the racks. Derek was up front doing the register and making sure everything was accounted for. The store was quiet. I mean, really quiet. Like, the only sound you could hear was the music they played through the speakers, and even that was kind of low. That's when I heard something. It sounded like footsteps coming from the back storage room. At first, I thought maybe Derek had gone back there, but then I remembered seeing him at the front counter just a moment ago. I stood there for a second and listened. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around in that storage room. I called out and asked if anyone was back there. Nobody answered. So I walked back towards the storage room to check it out. The door was closed, which was normal because we usually kept it closed at the end of the day. But when I opened it and looked inside, there was nobody there. The storage room was completely empty. There were shelves with boxes of inventory, a couple of old filing cabinets, and some cleaning supplies, but no person. I thought it was strange, but I figured maybe I had misheard something, or maybe it was just noise from the mall. Sometimes you could hear sounds from other stores or the mall corridors echoing through the walls. So I shrugged it off and went back to folding clothes. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, the sound was more distinct. It definitely sounded like footsteps, but they were coming from the back corner of the men's section. I looked over there and I couldn't see anyone. The men's section was kind of separated from the rest of the store because of how the racks were arranged. There was this corner area where the dressing rooms were, and sometimes it was hard to see if someone was over there or not. I walked over to that area, and I called out to see if anyone was there. I got no response. That's when I started to feel a little uneasy. I remember feeling this weird cold spot as I walked through that area. It was like someone had opened a door to outside or something, but the mall doors were nowhere near there. And besides, it was a warm evening. I went back up front and mentioned it to Derek. I asked him if he had heard anything strange. Derek looked at me and said that he hadn't heard anything, but he also said that he had felt weird vibrations coming from somewhere in the store a few times that night. He said it was like something was moving around, but whenever he looked, there was nobody there. We both kind of exchanged this look like, okay, this is getting a little weird, but we didn't want to seem paranoid or anything, so we just kind of dismissed it and continued with our closing duties. Derek went to the back to count the register and do some paperwork in the office, which was adjacent to the storage room. I stayed up front and continued organizing displays and making sure everything looked good for the next day. I was up there for maybe 10 minutes or so when I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was the sound of hangers moving. You know that distinctive sound when you move a bunch of hangers on a clothing rack? That metal on metal scraping sound? Well, that's what I heard. And it was coming from the men's section again, specifically from that back corner area. I turned around quickly to look, and I swear I saw the hangers on one of the racks moving. Like they were still swinging back and forth, but there was nobody near them. No breeze, no air conditioning vent nearby. Nothing that would explain why they would be moving on their own. At that point, I felt a chill run down my spine. I was genuinely creeped out. I walked back there to get a closer look at the racks, and the hangers were still slightly moving. I reached out to grab them to stop them, and as soon as I touched the rack, the hangers stopped moving completely. It was the strangest thing. I called out for Derek again and asked him to come up front. He came out of the office, and I told him that I had just seen the hangers on the clothing rack moving by themselves. Derek kind of looked at me with this expression like he wasn't sure what to think. He asked me if I was sure, and I told him yes, I was absolutely sure. He kind of nodded and said that maybe it was the air conditioning or something, but I could tell he was being dismissive about it. We decided to finish up closing as quickly as possible. Derek told me to finish organizing the front displays while he locked up the back. So I was working up front, and Derek went towards the back of the store. I was putting some folded items on a table when I heard Derek call out my name from the back. He sounded kind of alarmed. I immediately walked towards the back where Derek was, which was near the storage room. Derek was standing there looking into the storage room, and he asked me if I'd gone back there recently. I told him no. I hadn't been back there since earlier when I checked for whoever was making those footstep sounds. Derek said that it looked like someone had been moving boxes around. He said that the boxes were stacked differently than how we had left them that morning. We both stood there looking at the storage room, and neither of us wanted to go in there. There was just this feeling. I can't really explain it, but it felt like we were not alone. It felt like something was watching us from inside that storage room. The temperature seemed colder, too. Derek decided to take a step inside the storage room to look around more carefully. He walked in slowly and started looking at the boxes. He was moving some of them to see if anyone was hidden back there, but there was nowhere for anyone to hide. It was just boxes and shelves. That's when Derek suddenly let out this yell. It wasn't a scream exactly, but it was a loud shout of surprise or alarm. He backed out of the storage room quickly, and he had this look on his face like he had just seen something that terrified him. I asked him what happened and what he had seen, but Derek was kind of stuttering and having trouble getting his words out. Finally, Derek told me that he had felt something cold brush against his face. He said it was like a sudden gust of cold air, but it felt more like, he described it as feeling like a hand. a cold hand that had brushed across his cheek. He said it happened so fast that he couldn't be sure, but it had startled him. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. We both just kind of stood there for a moment in silence. Then Derek said that we should finish closing up and get out of there. We didn't waste any time after that. We quickly went through the rest of the closing procedures. We checked all the fitting rooms to make sure nobody was in the store. We set the alarm, we locked all the doors, and then we left. When we got outside the store, Derek and I just kind of stood there for a moment. We didn't say much, but I could tell we were both unsettled by what had happened. Derek told me that this wasn't the first time something weird had happened in that store. He said that over the months he had worked there had been several incidents where he felt like something was off. He mentioned that a couple of times he had heard disembodied voices coming from the back of the store, and he had felt sudden cold spots in certain areas. I asked him why he hadn't mentioned this before, and he said that he didn't want to seem crazy or paranoid. He said he figured it was just his imagination or the old building settling or something. But after tonight, he said he was pretty convinced that something paranormal was going on in that store. We parted ways and went home. I remember lying in bed that night thinking about what had happened. I kept replaying the image of those hangers moving by themselves. I kept thinking about the cold feeling in that back corner. I kept thinking about Derek's description of feeling something cold touch his face. The next day I came into work, and Derek and I didn't really talk about it much. We kind of acted like it was no big deal, but I could tell that he was just as freaked out as I was. Over the next few weeks, I continued to work shifts at the store, and I started noticing more and more strange things. There was this one shift where I was folding clothes in the back corner of the men's section, and I kept hearing what sounded like someone calling my name. It was a whisper, like a very faint voice saying, "Hey, hey," over and over again. But every time I turned around to look, there was nobody there, nobody near me, and nobody anywhere in the store, actually. Another time, I was working with a different coworker named Sarah. Sarah was new to the store, and she didn't know about the strange occurrences. We were both up front at the registers when Sarah mentioned that she had felt really cold in the back corner of the men's section. She said that when she went back there to restock some jeans, she had felt this sudden drop in temperature. She said it was so cold that she could see her breath. But when she stepped away from that area, the temperature went back to normal. Sarah asked me if the air conditioning unit had a vent back there or something, and I told her that it didn't. The air conditioning for that section worked fine, and it wasn't particularly cold anywhere else in the store. Sarah kind of shrugged it off, but I could tell that the experience had unnerved her a bit. As the weeks went on, I started doing some research about the store and the building it was in. I wanted to see if there was any history of something bad happening there. I found out that the mall had been built back in the 1970s, and the Fashion Hub store had been there since the early 1990s. I couldn't find any specific information about anything bad happening in that particular store, but I did find out that there had been a couple of deaths in the mall over the years. An elderly man had collapsed and died in the food court back in 1998, and a teenager had apparently committed suicide in one of the mall bathrooms in the early 2000s, around the same time I was working there. I don't know if either of those incidents had anything to do with what was happening in the Fashion Hub, but it did make me wonder. About a month after that night when Derek felt the cold hand, I was working another closing shift. This time, I was working with a different manager named Lisa. Lisa was kind of no-nonsense and didn't seem like the type to get spooked easily. We were closing up, and as usual, It was getting quiet in the store. I was in the women's section organizing some display items when I heard the stockroom door open. I looked over and I could see that the door was ajar. I knew we hadn't opened that door during the closing process because Derek and I had closed it tightly earlier. I walked over to the stockroom door and I opened it to look inside. As I did, I felt a sudden, intense cold. It was so cold that it made me gasp. It was like stepping into a freezer. I quickly shut the door and I called out for Lisa. I told her that something was going on with the stockroom. I said that the door had opened on its own and that it was freezing cold in there. Lisa came over and she opened the door to look inside. The stockroom looked completely normal. The boxes were stacked like they always were, and Lisa said that the temperature felt fine to her. She said it wasn't cold at all. I was confused because I had felt an intense cold, but she wasn't feeling it. She suggested that maybe I was just tired or my body temperature was off or something. But I knew what I had felt. It had been real. At that point, I made a decision. I knew that I couldn't work at that store anymore. Something was going on there that I couldn't explain, and it was making me incredibly uncomfortable. I didn't want to keep experiencing these strange occurrences, and I was genuinely afraid that whatever was causing them might become more aggressive or dangerous. I gave my 2 weeks' notice the next day. I didn't tell my manager, Lisa, about the paranormal stuff. I just told her that I had found another job and that I needed to move on. She accepted my resignation without much issue. During my final 2 weeks at the store, I continued to experience strange things. I heard more whispers. I felt more cold spots. I saw the hangers move again a couple of times. But I did my job and I kept my head down. I was counting down the days until I could leave. One of my last shifts was a closing shift with Derek. We were locking up, and just before we left, Derek asked me if I had experienced anything else paranormal in the store. Since that night, we had felt and seen all those things. I told him yes, I had experienced quite a few more incidents. Derek nodded like he wasn't surprised. He told me that he had been experiencing things too. He said that he had become convinced that the store was haunted. Derek told me that he had done some research of his own, and he had found out that a store employee had apparently died in the building many years ago. He said that it had happened before the fashion hub had even moved in, but the building had housed different businesses over the years. He said that an employee at one of the previous businesses had suffered a fatal heart attack in the stockroom. He said that nobody knew exactly when it had happened or which business it was, but he had heard about it from one of the other long-term mall employees. Derek suggested that maybe the spirit of that person was still haunting the building, specifically the area where they had died, which would explain why the stockroom and the back corner of the men's section had the most paranormal activity. Those areas were probably closest to where the person had collapsed. I found that explanation plausible. It made sense that if someone had died in that building, their spirit might still be lingering there, especially if they had passed away suddenly or traumatically. My final day at the store came, and I finished my shift and said goodbye to Derek and the other coworkers. I was genuinely relieved to be leaving. As I walked out of the store for the last time, I felt this weight lift off of me. It was like I was escaping from something that had been pressing down on me the entire time I worked there. I never went back to the fashion hub after I quit. A few years later, I heard that the store had closed down. I don't know if the paranormal activity had anything to do with it, but it wouldn't surprise me. I can't imagine anyone being comfortable working in a place where strange things are constantly happening. To this day, I still think about my time working at that store. The experiences I had there have made me a believer in the paranormal. I don't know for certain what was haunting that place, but I know that something was there. Something that could move objects, that could change the temperature of a room, and that could make its presence known in ways that were impossible to explain through rational means. If anyone reading this has worked in a retail store or any other building where they experienced paranormal activity, I'd love to hear about it. I think there are more haunted places out there than people realize. We just don't always talk about them because we're afraid of being judged or not being believed. But I'm telling you now that what happened in that store was very real to me, and I'm convinced that there are other people out there who have experienced similar things. I still get chills when I think about those cold spots, those moving hangers, and that feeling of being watched while working in that store. And I still wonder sometimes about the spirit or whatever it was that was haunting the fashion hub. I wonder if it's still there in that stockroom, waiting for the next person to come along and experience the unexplained events that I went through.